All right, welcome to part two of our lecture. We're going to talk about some theories of stress now. We'll talk about Karasik's demand control model that came out in the 70s but is nonetheless quite popular today. Then we'll talk about the person environment fit model, and then we'll talk about a number of individual differences that have been known to help with the resistance to stress. Let's begin by talking about Karasik's demand control model. Basically, Karasik told us that there are two factors that basically interact with each other, job demands and control, to determine the amount of stress an employee experiences. These two factors, again, are job demands and control. Job demands refer to how much of a workload we have, as well as the intellectual requirements of a job. And then control, or another name for it is decision latitude, refers to how much autonomy we have or how much decision making we have to perform our own job. The two factors, job control and job demands, um, interact, as I said, to produce four categories of stressful job. There are low strain jobs, which are high in control but low in demands. There are active jobs, which are high in control and high in psychological demands. Then there are what are called passive jobs, which are low in control but also low in demands. And then there are high strain jobs, which are low in control and high in demands. You really don't want to be in a high strain job where you have no control but a lot of demands. That's probably the worst place to be, and that's what Karasik's research, as well as other people who test this model, tell us. But you also don't want to be in a passive job where you have no demands and no control. That's also an area that can be very stressful. If you have to, you want to be kind of up on the top. An active job is what I would consider my own. I have a lot of control, but a lot of demands. But this is also an interesting model to look at. The person environment fit model deals with whether or not employees have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that fit with what a job requires. So it's really looking at this fit between a person and their environment. And what this hypothesis, or the hypothesis of this model, basically tells us is that when there's not a good fit between what the person brings to an organization and what's required of that organization or that environment, there's going to be some stress. But it also considers external influences like social support from family and work sources. So if you have that social support and there is a lack of fit, that will help alleviate that. So one of the common ways that we tend to look at this is something else called person organization fit. And that basically asks whether or not there is a fit between a person's values, their styles, and their characteristics and the culture of an organization. Let's take a brief look at some of the individual differences that factor into our resistance or non-resistance to stress. All of the things that I'm going to talk about are what we call moderators of the stressor-strain relationship. What this means is that the relationship between the different types of stressors that we've been talking about and the outcomes, or what we call strains, depends upon where you lie on the different variables that I talk about here. So let's begin with locus of control. Locus of control is a personality variable that refers to the belief of individuals that what happens to them is under their control. So if you believe that you control most of what goes on in your life, you are said to be or high on internal locus of control. If, on the other hand, you believe that things are completely out of your control, that it's always something else or someone else that controls things for you, you would have a high external locus of control. What stress researchers tell us is that those who have a high internal locus of control, that is, those that really believe that what happens to them is under their control, they experience lower effects or strains than do externals exposed to the same stressors. So, if at all possible, you hope that you're an internal. Another moderator of the stressor strain relationship that tells us how individuals react to stress and is what we call hardiness. Hardiness is a set of personality characteristics that help provide resistance to stress. People who are high in hardiness feel that they are in control of their lives, so that would be a little bit of that internal locus of control that we were just talking about. They feel a sense of commitment to their family and their work goals and values, and they see change as a challenge rather than as an obstacle. Finally, there's self-esteem. What we know with self-esteem is those who have high self-esteem are basically set up with more resources and are less likely to experience strains or negative stressors than those who have low self-esteem. And this is just an example of how we in research conceptualize moderators. One of the biggest things that we study in stress, or the big daddy individual difference in stress, is what we call the TABP, or the type A behavior pattern, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. Another phrase that we use for this is called the coronary prone personality. Individuals displaying type A personality pattern or behavior pattern are characterized by being highly ambitious, highly impatient, and easily aroused, but also they have a high sense of time urgency. They're just always in a hurry. And these are the people that we tend to view as always living in the fast lane. So here is someone with the type A behavior personality pattern, and he says, hey, I'm a type A. I must achieve more and more in less time. I'm obsessed with saving time. Look at my shave. Know how I got that? 2 electric razors at once. Yeah, baby. Heart attack city. Here I come. Okay, that was just a funny look at it. There are 4 different components or subcomponents of the type A behavior personality pattern. There's the hostility subcomponent, which is most associated with heart disease. Then there is that tendency to be very achievement striving. There is the impatience and irritability. These are the people who get very frustrated when they're slowed down, and they hate to be in the grocery line behind someone who's taking too long. And then there's time urgency, which is the sense that they never have enough time to do things. So we've covered a lot of stressors. So what is it that organizations can do to deal with stressors? In general, there are 3 different types of interventions that exist for organizations to engage in. They are primary interventions, there are secondary interventions, and then there are tertiary interventions. Primary interventions is what you hope organizations will do. This is before things happen, and they want to prevent or reduce the number or intensity of stressors. These are the type of programs where they really focus on the work environment, on the culture, and they want to remove the stressors. And they're going to do this through redesigning work and maybe helping to change the way employees even view stressors in the workplace. Secondary secondary programs are used when things have already occurred. Something bad has already occurred in the workplace, and they're trying to deal with how people respond to the stressors. So the focus is on individuals, and the basic assumption is if you can't remove the stressors, at least try to change your reaction. So this is where the organization tries to implement some relaxation training. Maybe they're offering employees some yoga classes or stress management training. Tertiary response is this is when basically the crap has already hit the fan. It's too late. So the damage has already been done. People are already hurt. We're still focusing on the individual, but the damage has already occurred, and basically we're helping them in the form of employee assistance programs or medical care. Here's another stress prevention technique. This guy knocks his person out and he says, it was my short-term strategy for relieving stress. Let's move on and talk about violence at work. I'll start off by telling you that there'll be a clip that we're going to play here, and at your convenience you can watch this, but it has to do with the killing of the Yale medical student who was just about to get married and was killed by her coworker. And if you recall, this is a coworker who somehow or another stuffed her body in a wall, and it was very tragic. But nonetheless, we'll post that for you and you can take a look at that. And in light of the recent shootings that we just heard about at Fort Hood, we understand that workplace violence is becoming increasingly a difficult issue to deal with. In fact, let's take a look at some numbers. So what we have seen is that actually fatal workplace violence is actually declining. So in 1994, there were 771 fatal workplace deaths. In 2008, that went down to 507, and that was a decrease of about 52%. Unfortunately, we also know that non-fatal workplace assaults, non-fatal, are on the rise. So in 2005, non-fatal workplace assaults were in the range of 14,000, 14,213 to be specific. Unfortunately, in 2007, that number grew to 16,840. This was an increase in 15.6%. When we take a look at workplace violence and gender, unfortunately what we find is that women are twice as likely as men to be attacked on the job. Not good for women. So I asked the question, is the workplace safe? In the past, the workplace was seen as a protected environment and a safe zone for everyone. Unfortunately, today, violence is much more common. In general, there are two categories of violence. There is violent actions carried out by non-employees against an employee. For example, this would be when you see in the news someone who comes in to rob a convenience store or an assailant who harms a policeman in the middle of being arrested or something like that. What researchers in neuropsychology are much more interested in studying and trying to prevent is the violence that's perpetrated by employees against other employees. But why does this violence occur anyways? Well, there's a number of factors that are occurring in the nature of work that are affecting this incidence or increase in violence. One is the increase of layoffs, mergers, acquisitions, which all increase stress. And in a tough economy like we're experiencing now, we're seeing this more and more. Diverse workplaces. Well, we tend to think that that's a good thing, and sometimes diversity can actually lead to prejudice and bias. We are just now figuring out what's going on with this whole Fort Hood case and the shootings there. But unfortunately, what I think we might find is that the diversity of the Army that might have led to some prejudice and bias, and specifically targeted against Muslims in this case, which is something we obviously don't want to see because diversity is a good thing. The fact that our economy requires us to be even leaner and more efficient is going to reduce layers of management and, again, lower communication, which also leads to stress. We're seeing a lot more drug abuse and alcohol abuse, which tends to lower employees' inhibitions to violence, which is also a bad thing. And then the baby boomers have left fewer jobs, and with fewer jobs, there's fewer chances for promotion and more stress. In order to really to study stress and to figure out violence, you have to look at an individual's personal characteristics, but you can't neglect the environment that they work in as well. So we're going to take a look at some factors that lead to violence. What you see here in red and green are three levels of violence. And it's interesting. I encourage all of you guys to kind of look at what happened with this Fort Hood workplace violence killing, as well as what happened with the Yale student, and see if the behavior of either of these individuals fits into the sequential series of events that I'm showing you here. So it starts off kind of low with a person who is arguing or refusing to cooperate with their supervisor. They're not getting along with others, and it just increases to level 2, where they're talking about hurting other people or hurting equipment, refusing to obey policies, and then it goes to level 3, which is, unfortunately what happened with Fort Hood and the student at Yale. So this is another just way of looking at it. The individual suffers some sort of trauma, and they basically believe that they have a problem. Either they've lost their job or maybe they've experienced divorce, and they start thinking to themselves that these problems are unsolvable, and they project all of their situation onto the organization or the people in the organization, and they become increasingly egocentric and say things like, "How could they do this to me? Don't they know how important I am?" They begin to feel as if if they don't do something, then something's going to happen worse to them. So the violent act is seen as the only way out, and then finally, unfortunately, the violent act is committed. The typical violent worker, with the exception of a worker suffering a serious mental disorder, most cases of workplace violence involve some feeling of being treated unfairly. Um, and even with this Fort Hood killings here, the perpetrator was a psychiatrist, and so it's hard to believe that this person was suffering a serious mental disorder. So it'll be interesting to find out what exactly this guy's beef was. But in general, the perpetrator usually has some real or imagined grievance against the organization or one of its employees. And I think in our case, this Fort Hood person had a real grievance against the Army. And the war that we have been engaged in the Middle East. The typical violent worker has a number of characteristics, such as those that you see. They don't participate in organizational events. Typically, they have few outside interests. They typically have worked for the company for some time, but not always. And so, even if you have these characteristics, it doesn't mean that you will engage in workplace violence. So, for example, the typical violent worker is a white male between 25 and 50. That was not the case with our Fort Hood killings. Um, the typical violent worker, though, it says abuses alcohol, and we know that the perpetrator in the Fort Hood killings was dealing with an alcohol problem. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will engage in violence if you display any of these characteristics. In terms of theories of violence, the frustration aggression hypothesis is common. But it's an older way of looking at it, and it basically argued that people who are frustrated are more likely to be aggressive. But ultimately, this theory was found to be too broad because we have found that not all frustrated individuals act aggressively, and vice versa. Not all aggressive acts are the result of frustration. The modern view is that frustration can lead to a stress reaction, and certain individuals can expend energy and violence to relieve the stress, but again, not everyone does. What are the effects of control? Well, we know that autonomy or control is very important when it comes to stressors. So, two people could experience the same stressor. For example, two people could both lose their job, both have feelings of frustration and dissatisfaction. But if one person feels like they have a high level of control, or they're more likely to engage in constructive behavior, whereas a person who has low control is more likely to engage in destructive behavior. Another important theory with regard to violence in the workplace is organizational justice. Um, Basically, what this suggests is that a number of violent acts can be understood by analyzing whether or not people have grievances or feel like they've been treated unfairly. So, layoffs and firings are a type of a perceived injustice where people feel like what they receive is not fair, or performance appraisals. People, may often perceive that they're not being treated fairly in terms of the process used to determine those performance appraisals. So, conclusions. Conclusion number one: you are at much greater risk of being the victim of workplace violence than your parents. Employees need avenues for communicating concerns about the fairness of organizational decisions that affect them. And finally, managers need to be sensitive to signs of potential trouble in the form of individual worker behaviors. This is a fascinating topic, and again, I think we'll see issues coming up more and more, unfortunately, and as our economy seems to worsen, I think this is going to get worse and worse. But we'll hope that things get better. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and I will look forward to talking with you soon. Take care. Bye bye.